This is Whitey's world. You go from Squantum, where he lived with Kathy, it's basically 6 miles if you drive it, up to Castle Island over there. That's Southie, where he did most of his crime. He murdered people there, he buried people there, and he went to sleep there. So that's his world.
Talking about certain themes, we can reference other films. Does that work?
Sure. Whatever you want.
We've got a lot of films to discuss in 30 minutes.
Yeah.
I figured a good place to start would just be what drew you to Whitey as subject matter. What was it that spoke specifically to you?
Yeah.
Maybe not the broader themes or the broader implications, but maybe him as a figure.
Yeah. Well, you know, if you look at my resume, you know that I'm a true crime person. So of course I've always known about the Whitey Bulger story and have long been fascinated by Bulger. Fascinated not just because he's a guy who ruled the Boston underworld for 25 years and didn't even get stopped for a traffic ticket, but also because of the incredible myth-making machine behind him. You know, this is a guy who's had a dozen books written about him, 2 feature films are in the works, there's been other television programming. You know, we're on a first-name basis with him. I mean, Whitey, you say Whitey, you know who the guy is. And yet we know very little about him. And there's so much conflicting mythology and a lot of allegations of corruption that have never really been deeply looked into. And yet, despite this interest, I never thought I had anything to add because so many books, so much has been written about him. But when it was announced that he was actually caught after being on the lam for 16 years and that they were actually going to bring him to trial, I thought this is a perfect opportunity to cover the trial and use that as a present tense springboard to kind of separate the man from the myth, to go into what, you know, what made this guy possible and what is myth and what is real. And that's kind of how I approached the project.
You mentioned that you're a fan of true crime, and that's like a genre we understand in literature, but how do you arrive upon the structure of how you're going to present the story when you return to this kind of mode so many times? Like, how do you determine how this story gets told? Especially as you say, like you weren't sure you had anything to add, but then
Right.
something new happens.
Well, you know, look, different stories have different demands, but generally speaking, I think I'm interested and have made a lot of films about trials. And we could talk specifically in a minute about Whitey and what that approach was like. But in general, I'm Brothers Keeper, the 3 Paradise Lost movies, even Crude is a trial in another country, of course. But I'm interested in crime and the intersection of crimes when they actually get to trial for a couple of reasons. You know, as a storyteller, my little niche in documentary has always been for the last 2 decades, and not the only person who does this or who believes this, but I enjoy, from a storytelling standpoint, trying to give a documentary all of the narrative qualities that a good scripted film has, you know, to try to take real life and give it a dramatic structure, you know, with all, in the classic sense of the word, rising and falling action and, you know, all of that dramatic narrative stuff that makes a good film. And trials are a natural for that, because there's obviously a beginning, a middle, and an end. The very definition of drama is conflict, and when you have two opposing sides, each vying for their version of the truth, that produces conflict. The stakes are very high because usually somebody's on trial for something very serious. So just as a storyteller, I gravitate towards that and always have. But from a social issues standpoint, I am also very interested, and this is where the documentarian comes in, the social issues documentarian. I'm very interested in our criminal justice system and its proper operation. I think the most treasured value we have as Americans, you know, our core, you know, perhaps the most core American value is a belief in our personal liberty. And prosecutors and the criminal justice system have a very unique power to take that liberty away. And so I think it's the duty of anyone in the media and any citizen to make sure that the criminal justice system operates fairly and blindly, like Lady Justice is supposed to be blind. And unfortunately, the criminal justice system is run by human beings, and when you empower human beings to run a system, it's obviously going to run off the rails from time to time and make mistakes. And so, and when the criminal justice system makes mistakes, like in the case of the West Memphis Three, people's fundamental right of freedom gets violated. And so, for whatever reason, that issue speaks to me. So, as both a storyteller and as somebody who cares about the proper functioning of the justice system, I guess that's why I've been attracted to these kinds of films over the years.
And what about the component of history? Because in addition to covering these things, you also have to provide a kind of context to everything that's happened. And I think it was Paradise Lost 3 where you have the phrase, past is prologue, which I thought was really interesting, because it is kind of, the battle is the court case, but in addition to that, you have to then spell out everything that's happened before. And then also, you've got so many POVs that the very concept of history becomes problematic, like whose perspective is it coming from?
Right.
How do you kind of juggle that component of the narrative?
Right. Well, one of the themes that, you know, I think runs through my work is how, you know, how different interests try to shape the narrative for their own purposes, and I think that really reaches full expression in the Bulger story. You know, you have various vested interests who want the story to be a certain way, including Bulger. You know, one of the driving forces of the film, or driving questions of the film, is whether or not he was an informant. You know, the conventional wisdom and the story the FBI would like you to believe is that he was an informant, but there's compelling evidence that the defense presents within the film to demonstrate that he might not have been an informant at all. You know, so you have these competing interests, and you have the question of whether or not Bulger, you know, and by the way, this is the first time we've ever heard from Bulger ever. In all of these media projects, we've never heard from Bulger, so I think one of the strengths of the film is that Bulger is actually, you hear his voice for the first time, willingly. Of course, he's been, you know, captured on police surveillance tapes, but this is the first time he's answered questions for a movie. But just because it comes out of Bulger's mouth doesn't mean we should accept it as the truth. And so I want audiences to ask, you know, is Bulger sincere when he says he was not an informant, or is it his attempt to kind of control his image because he's at the end of his life and the worst thing a criminal can do is be a rat? And so is this an effort of Bulger to you know, polish up his image before, you know, so he can pass into the Criminals Hall of Fame before he goes? Or is he a guy, you know, who knows that he's not getting out of this predicament, and it's important for him to let the world know that there's some deep corruption within the FBI? You know, Kevin Weeks, who was interviewed for the film, who was Bulger's right-hand man, he kind of gets one of the last comments in the film saying, you know, whether or not Bulger killed women, we'll never know. Whether or not Bulger was an informant, we'll never know the truth until people start telling the truth. And I think that, you know, very much this film, aesthetically speaking, is about the power to shape a narrative, who's in control of that narrative, and how the news often presents things in extreme black and white, when in fact the truth of most situations is much more nuanced and complex.
When you're dealing with recording public figures, be it like ones that are notorious or some that are just iconoclastic personalities or artists, can you identify when there's a kind of performativity going on? Is that something that you're accustomed to now observing?
You know, I hate to prejudge people. I you know, accept everybody at their face value, and I want the audience to dig down and ask these questions. You know, and sometimes when people are performing for the camera, they're unwittingly communicating something else that's real. You know, so I try to take people at their face value. Obviously, I have to do my homework and make sure that they're not pulling one over on me. But you know, I think the goal of my films are to present a multiplicity of viewpoints, treat the audience like a jury member, and let the audience make up its mind.
And what about, you use a lot of media footage in yours too, so I think that there's always that counterpoint that you're constructing your own mediation, kind of acknowledging it, but also maybe investigating how media represents these.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, you know, look, I think obviously I'm a part of the media, and I acknowledge that, you know, and I think all documentary films are inherently subjective, so any documentarian who tells you he's presenting the objective truth about a situation is kidding themselves. You know, we make a zillion decisions that are inherently subjective, from what footage to leave out of the film to how, even going into starting at the shoot, what to shoot, what not to shoot, how the camera is framed. So there's a million subjective decisions that go into presenting a narrative. And what I like to go for is more of the emotional truth of a situation, as opposed to like the capital T objective truth. And I don't think objective truth is actually even possible. It's why I embrace ambiguity in my films, and why some people hate the fact that the films are very ambiguous. You know, the media tends to present, you know, so that's how I feel like I'm a part of the media. How I feel I'm distinct is I allow for those point of views and for lack of closure on issues, which I think is more approximate to how life is. And I think the media tends to present things in very black and white terms, and doesn't allow for the nuance or complexity of issues.
And the people you're doing the interviews with in those tend to, it's something that comes up in your film where if there's a group of people that don't maybe necessarily know one another, but the event that they're embroiled in has kind of brought them together in maybe a literal or just in a proximity because of that. And it's something that seems like is important, especially in this film, when you structure the meal at the end or the drinks that are happening.
Yeah.
When you're observing that, what are you observing when an event like this or something like in the Paradise Lost series is kind of bringing a lot of people that otherwise wouldn't know one another together because of something pretty traumatic or problematic with regard to like institutions and how they fail them?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think you hit it on the head. By, you know, people with a shared interest, if you bring them together. I mean, that meal at the end of the movie was actually our idea. We brought them together, and it's too bad we weren't able to use more of it, you know, because there was a lot of good things said. But I just think when you look, any filmmaking situation is slightly artificial for people, you know, but if you can create an environment where people feel comfortable and they have like-minded interests, I think it's a catalyst for real things to come out of them. So when you figure out a way to bring people together in a real way, even though it was your idea, but you bring people together from different backgrounds, and they have the same kind of connective tissue to the event, you know, it's a natural way of creating an environment where people can be themselves, and you can, you know, it's a catalyst for things to come out of people's mouths that you might not have otherwise captured.
And to have that structured at the end, along with some of the very vocal and poignant condemnations of institutions in the United States. Like it seems like it's a recurring thing about the notion of the United States, and you mentioned it before in the relationship to liberty. More in this film more than any of the others, it seems like that it's the loaded bullet at the end. Like,
well, you know, I think look, I'm proud to be an American, and I think America is a great country. The idea of America is a great country, you know. But systems are run by human beings, and I think it's the job of the media to, you know, put a spotlight on things when things go awry. And to think that the government decided in their zeal to bring down La Cosa Nostra, the mafia, which was a national objective of the FBI, which is a noble cause, but to think that they made decisions knowingly choosing who will live and who will die I don't think is the proper role of government. I mean, we have to remember that these institutions represent us. They shouldn't be, you know, autonomous and not answerable to the people. And I think by showing the victims' family members intercut at the end with those final statements, it's a way of reminding people that, you know, the foundation of this country is that these institutions are supposed to serve us and not betray us. And I think these institutions betrayed these families by knowingly making decisions that would lead to the deaths of some of their loved ones.
And to go back to the theme of the rat, maybe it's because whistleblowing is such a important thing right now in discourse around surveillance and other things. I'm curious, like the relationship that being an informant has with the general act of being a whistleblower, or even a documentary filmmaker that's, you know, raising attention towards different social issues through making the films. Was this something that you were aware of while you were making it, like how they were kind of echoing one another?
Well, actually, yes and no. That's a good way to put it. I mean, you know, I think I was coming at it from a slightly different perspective. You know, I think the criminal justice system has become over-reliant on the use of informants. It's informants and whistleblowers. Whistleblowers are a different category. I mean, whistleblowers, you know, unfortunately have been penalized, and in fact, you know, certain whistleblowers should be celebrated as heroes as opposed to condemning them. But informants have become kind of the mother's milk of criminal investigation, and when you have a system of crime solving that's based on getting into bed with murderers and thugs, bad things can happen, you know, and the FBI allowed these bad things to happen. I mean, if you accept the fact that Bulger was an informant, then being an informant doesn't mean you have a license to kill people. And the FBI knew he was killing people. Or certain people in the FBI, I should say, knew he was killing people. You know, that shouldn't be allowed to happen under any circumstance. So if he was an informant, it's bad enough that was extended to the point where it was decided that certain people could live, certain people could die. If he was not an informant, as the defense alleges, and again, the film is not saying he was or he wasn't. The film is saying there were a lot of troubling questions. If he was an informant, you know, there's too many unanswered questions. And if he was not an informant, then it's really problematic as to what the government did in their crime fighting zeal to bring down the mob. They broke a lot of rules, and at the end of the day, that's what the film is about, is the integrity of our institutions. And, you know, I wish I could say that it was just limited to Boston, but in New York with Gregory Scarpa, for example, here's a FBI informant who was, you know, recruited to help bring down the Colombo crime family, and it is alleged, it was alleged at trial that he killed, while an FBI informant, he killed over 50 people. You know, that shouldn't happen. We shouldn't be getting into bed with murderers and thugs to solve other crimes. There's got to be other ways of solving crime that doesn't destroy the integrity of the institutions that are fighting that crime.
And how do you feel about the statement, memory is a political act, that comes up also poignantly near the end of the film? Like, do you feel like that relates to the investigation, like certain people refusing to kind of let this go by? Is it a way of the families coping with, you know, having to deal with a loss?
Well, you know, we live in a society where people like just move on and allow things to happen, and I think increasingly our threshold of tolerance for government misdeeds has become lower and lower, or I guess higher and higher. We accept, you know, we accept these things and move on. And I think memory, as David Bowery so aptly says in the movie, memory is a political act. You know, that's why I think documentarians do what they do. You know, you have to memorialize these things, or they're going to happen again. You know, at the end of the movie, the U.S. Attorney for the District of Massachusetts, Carmen Ortiz, stands in front of the press and says, you know, with the conviction of James Bulger, this ugly chapter in Boston's history is now over. But is it over? How can it be over if we don't know who's responsible, if we don't know how Bulger got to reign over this criminal empire with impunity for over 2 decades? No one, I think it strains credibility to think that John Connolly, you know, who has been, you know, special agent, you know, FBI special agent John Connolly, who's sitting in a prison in Florida, you know, many people feel that he's been scapegoated. Not that he's a good guy, he did bad things, but to say that all of this murder and mayhem for 2 decades went on with only his knowledge and his supervisor, John Morris, given the fact that the FBI is somewhat of a paramilitary organization that has a chain of command, it just strains credibility. You know, it strains credibility that many more people weren't involved in this conspiracy. And if in fact he was not an informant and the conspiracy runs much deeper, in other words, you know, Bulger claims that he was not the informant, he was paying people in the FBI, many people in the FBI, to give him information and to keep him from getting indicted. And that the FBI and the Department of Justice used his name on affidavits and search warrants to close their cases, when in fact he never gave the information that these affidavits and search warrants claim that he gave. In other words, they were just using his name as a commodity. I don't know if that's true or not, but the trial this summer in Boston shut down any inquiry into those areas. And I think that was, you know, the people of Boston, the victims' family members in particular, deserve to have answers to those questions. And so, you know, if we don't, you know, if we don't constantly remind people that this history is unresolved, that no, it's not over, you know, I think, as the old adage goes, you know, if you don't remember history, you're condemned to repeat it. And, you know, that's why it's important to remember.
Do you notice this ambiguity coming up at the end of most of your films, like that there are still these questions that both have been left unanswered, but also certain people try to believe that there's a closure that there really isn't? Like, I mean, it seems to run from the very literal in the West Memphis Three of the state really feeling like they've comfortably still have them guilty, but even like something like the work with Paul Simon, where like the notion of the state's position on apartheid and his involvement on that, it doesn't ever seem to fully resolve itself.
Right, that's a great point, you know, and that's why I think I kind of embrace that ambiguity and think that it mirrors how life really unfolds and what the difference is between the news media looking for closure, looking for the third act to be over, report the story, whereas I think, you know, unfortunately questions linger in the West Memphis Three case in particular. It's, you know, when Scott Ellington, the prosecutor in the West Memphis Three case, stands up and says, hey, as far as I'm concerned, you know, the real killers have been caught and now we're letting them go today and the case closed. That's ludicrous. I mean, if the state of Arkansas really believed that they were taking somebody off of death row and taking 2 other people who had life without parole sentences, and they really believed that these guys were devil-worshipping murderers who sacrificed 3 8-year-olds to the devil in the woods in Arkansas. Why, if they really believed that, would they take them off of death row and send them out into the streets? It's illogical. So it's an attempt to shut down a deeper inquiry into the corruption and ineptitude that allowed 3 people to rot in prison for almost 2 decades. It's to avoid the financial responsibility, because when you're, you know, the rule of thumb is you get $1 million a year for every year that you're wrongfully incarcerated. So 18 times 3, you know, the state of Arkansas was looking to not pay out $54 million or have any additional litigation. It was so transparent, you know. So just like in Boston, they say, hey, Bulger's in prison, it's over. You know, in Arkansas, they said, hey, these guys are out of prison, they served 18 years, they pled guilty. What a word game that is. They were forced to plead guilty to get off of death row, get out of their life sentences for the other 2. They stood up in court and said, we're innocent, but we're going to plead guilty to this Alford plea to get out of prison. And then an hour later at the press conference, you know, the prosecutor says, hey, they pled guilty, so they're guilty. I'm like, what are we, idiots? I mean, it's ludicrous. But that's an attempt to just shut down any further inquiry, just like I think in Boston, it was an effort to shut down any further inquiry. And frankly, some of the local media in Boston, I think, was complicit in trying to shut down that inquiry. You know, I was criticized for having, you know, by the Boston media for, you know, when the film came out in Sundance, it played in Boston for one screening for this program called Sundance USA, where they take some of the Sundance films and put it in, you know, screen it in satellite cities. And so my film screened once in Boston, and for the most part people loved it, and we had a very heated debate, but the handful of journalists who have covered this story, you know, cried foul that I would dare to even bring up the idea that he's not an informant, without disclosing the fact that, well, you've broken the story fed to you by the FBI that he was an informant, have written books about it, have made money off the idea that he's an informant. In the case of Dick Lair, Johnny Depp is playing Bulger off of one of your books, that he's an informant, and you're criticizing me for intellectual dishonesty? I mean, to me, what's intellectually dishonest is not acknowledging the conflict of interest. And again, my film isn't saying he was an informant, it's looking into the question of whether or not he was an informant while showing both sides. Whereas the Boston media, those people in particular, not all the Boston media, I shouldn't categorically say all Boston media, but those who had a vested interest in maintaining the informant story, you know, felt that you can't even talk about that, which is, you know, that to me is intellectually dishonest. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much.
Cool. All right. That was 45 minutes? 30. Oh. 30. Oh, good. Is that enough?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, good.
Really appreciate
Thanks a lot. Cool.
It's a great film.
Great, thanks.